Cool. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the session. My name is Vanessa Vu. I'm the co-host of the Rise and Shine podcast, and I'm here speaking with Jessica Nguyen, who is doing a lot of amazing things. Also, hosting a podcast called Project Voice. And but you're not hosting it alone, right? You're co-hosting it in the meanwhile. You've made a little team.
I've co-hosted before. I've been podcasting as Project Voice for the past 4 years, and I'm actually a one-person team usually, but I do have a team
Mm.
of various freelancers, transcribers, artists out there that I work with here and there. But yeah, it's mainly me. But with our recent scholarship program, I've had an amazing team of experienced podcast mentors.
Cool. We will get to that soon, but yeah, also to your Project Voice Fund, and you are also a writer. So you recently published a book, which I'm very excited about. I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Thank you. I'm excited for you to read as well. Yes, it's called Softly I Speak, published by the Louisiana Literature Press. It is a chapbook, so a book of poetry of my experiences growing up as a second generation Vietnamese American. Um, and it is divided into two parts, hurt and healing. And we can talk more about it later in the interview, like you said. But yeah, a little bit about the chapbook.
Yes, that was the super, super brief introduction. But where do I find you anyway right now? It looks warm. Like I'm wearing this jumper and you have
I
open
know.
windows.
So right. I just felt like it was a day that I needed some extra sunshine coming in. I am in Boston right now. Don't be deceived by the beautiful light coming in. It is winter, pretty cold here. Although this past week has been unseasonably warm. But yes, I am back in Boston after traveling and living abroad for the past few years.
Beautiful. I find this opportunity very exciting because I'm here broadcasting from Berlin. I'm not a native English speaker, so excuse my English if it's sometimes a bit slow and a bit wrong, also.
Amazing.
But
Oh.
yeah, it's super exciting that we can get Asian diasporic or Vietnamese diasporic rather perspectives from two different continents here, and we'll just explore our experiences we're making here and there. So I have never been in the States before, even though um, here in Germany we watch a lot of US series, we read books and movies. So the pop culture is super present here, but not just the general one, also the Asian diasporic one. And I was wondering, do you hear anything about Asians in Europe? Or is it just a one way thing?
I do. I do hear Asians in Europe. I have
Mhm.
a few friends in Germany, Vietnamese Germans actually, and they've shared with me their personal experiences
Mhm.
growing up in Germany. And it's interesting that there's a lot of common thread there in terms of, the cultural gaps that we experience growing up, as well as the generational ones, and growing up as a minority in a Western country, really. I've heard stories how it varies and depending on which European country you're from
Mm.
and how opinions differ. But I also think that you see the same thing in the US as well, where opinions and lived experiences are different based on where you are because the US is also very big
Yeah.
geographically. So definitely, yeah, interesting stories from your continent.
Was there anything you were surprised to hear when you think about stories you have exchanged?
Yeah, lots of systemic racism is still in place,
Mm.
and how racism at times can be a taboo issue, and how it exists in forms of microaggression as well as more explicit forms of violence and oppression in Europe. Um, and of course, I am only speaking on behalf of a few friends.
Mm.
And of course, there are other beautiful things that have come out of growing up in the Asian diaspora in Europe. I just don't know as much. I think that that each country is in a different place when it comes to talking about identity politics and social justice. Um, Here's an example. Well, a Vietnamese German friend of mine who shared her experience feels sometimes feels like she's not in a safe place sharing about her frustrations or growing up feeling different. And I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but Vietnamese Germans are oftentimes seen as Vietnamese and not Vietnamese Germans. Isn't that there's this this concept of hyphenated identity may not be as present at times, whereas in the U.S. we're very proud of that hyphenated identity at times,
Mm.
like have the Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, Black Americans, so on and so forth, or African Americans, so on and so forth. So I thought that was interesting to hear how, like, it's a bit different in Europe, but I mean, globalization exists
Mm.
and dialogues are constantly becoming more progressive in nature. So I think that I'm sure that their same conversations are happening around the world. And I was in Australia as well, and I say that people are at different points of their life and with their identity there compared to here or in Europe.
Yeah, but I can definitely see what you mean that the hyphenated identities are a super complex issue here in Germany. Like, I have never considered myself a German Vietnamese person. This came just very recently that I call myself Viet Deutsch. So Viet is like the Vietnamese abbreviation, but in German it's not even Viet. We say Vietnamesisch, which is super long term. And I started to put these together and just tried it out, and other people followed, which was quite cool to make your own label. But that's a thing that has only started like 2 or 3 years ago, and before that, it was always this tough fight of either being German or being Vietnamese. Usually, I fought for being German because German was obviously the norm and was better, and you try to fulfill the white standards and prove everyone that you're German enough by speaking German very well, by just speaking about German stuff, and trying to behave like a German, basically, faking it in the public. Yeah, and the US has always been a great source of kind of inspiration, all the pop culture that came here to see that they are somehow proud of their identity. So maybe we could be too. So that's definitely a big impact. But I was wondering whether this image that I or we as Asian or Vietnamese Germans had from over there is like even correct. Would you personally say that you always considered yourself like both and always proud of this identity? Was it always clear that you can be both at the same time or even more than that? Or is it just the pop culture that's coming to Europe?
Hmm. I think that it depends on the history of the regions. I was speaking with, for example, an Asian Australian activist, and she was sharing with me the history of Australia. I know I'm bringing this up so often, but it's the first example I can think of. And I thought it was interesting to see how civil rights history differs depending on which geographical location you're in. Like in the US, it's not, it's the institutions that are in place. It's a civil rights movement that happened in the 60s and, and all the work that happened before
Mm.
us that allowed us to have these conversations so naturally or and have so many people so passionate talking about it. Coming from a personal experience though, I grew up identifying myself as Vietnamese for a good chunk of my
Mm.
life. I didn't really question the other half of me, although I know very much myself that I am American. It's funny because like when I'm at home, my parents would call all the white people as Americans and us as Vietnamese. I
Oh,
don't know if
really?
you before, but yeah. So they're like me down,
Mm.
and that's the standard for Americans here.
Mm.
But going to college and attending my first Asian American Studies course, it was an eye-opening experience because it was my first introduction to diaspora stories, ethnic studies, I actually felt a little embarrassed going into this class because I was like, why am I taking a course on myself? I should already know myself already. But no, little did I know there was so much more to it, right? All the activists and authors and researchers who are within the Asian American space, or Vietnamese American space. It's very humbling, and it is sad for me to realize that I don't know as much as I should. And of course, that speaks to the flaws of our country's or my country's education system. Um, I know that there's been a growing push for ethnic studies in high school, as well as college, universities. There's been more interest in Asian American, African American, Latinx American studies, and that's great. But of course, we're still in an ongoing journey, given the fact that there's a lot that's happened within the past year. In addition to the pandemic, there was the whole awakening of the Black Lives Matter movement. Although it didn't start last year, but I felt like, to me, it was the biggest I've seen, like the largest it spread. And it's great to see that, there's more folks talking about race and being in these race spaces and learning about other people's lived experiences. I know I'm going a little bit off tangent there, but
No, it's
yeah.
all right. It's so interesting. I'm from where I'm coming, I just see like, wow, you can't even study Asian American studies. How amazing is that? We don't have like anything like this. It feels like we're standing on this empty field with dry soil and just trying to put a little plant in, but nobody cares really. Um, and it's completely different, but still you became interested in these kind of studies. So how come, if you say that you considered yourself Vietnamese? Because I feel like those people here in Germany who also start asking questions about identity or about Asianness or their Vietnamese heritage, all these things, in my observation, come from a point of confusion, and it's a search to oneself. You know so little about yourself. You have denied being something else than German all your life, and then suddenly you realize, shit, but I'm still living in this racist society. What am I doing here? And who are my parents? And then at the beginning of the 20s, a lot of people start to reflect on all of these things, and they start telling their stories, and I see more and more of filmmakers, podcasters, theater makers, and so on, coming up and doing things. But this is like really a process that starts in the 20s, and very often from a point of confusion and knowing nothing. So how was it in your case?
Yeah, I have learned to embrace both sides of me, being Vietnamese and American, identify as a Vietnamese American or an Asian American. And I feel the same way as you do when it comes to feeling stuck in between, not American enough, not Vietnamese American enough in my case, and, trying to find a way to meld these two sides of me together, and realizing that I can't just identify on one or the other. And there's beauty of identity. It's a social construct. And that I feel like knowing that has encouraged me to just own that concept of knowing that I'm enough in either way. And there is this danger of the single narrative. And I believe we talked about this before, about how we often so easily slide into these specific narratives of what it means to be Vietnamese. Like growing up in the US, like I was so ingrained with this idea of Vietnam as being impoverished and war stricken because of the Vietnam War. And it was this one narrative that, that I grew up in because of the education system. And even that I didn't know much of, except through my family's retellings of their experiences. Actually, my family's perspectives were what made me realize that, well, there was so much more color to behind Vietnam. There were so many more stories that aren't told, both sad and happy, you know, all the stories of modern day Vietnam that are like flourishing, and I love to see how much has grown over the years of my ancestors' homelands, and to know that there's more to it than meets the eye, and that it's important for us to expose ourselves to different forms of media, to take the initiative to do our own research, to reach out and connect with folks who have, are living in Vietnam, or like living, as part of the diaspora. I know we've spent like a lot of time in our last call just connecting with each other about our experiences growing up as Vietnamese, and talking about our wishes to just learn more about that side of ourselves, because we just didn't get that access growing up. And it's how life works, it's how history works. This is a product of history, and if we want to learn something that is not part of the mainstream, we have to take a little bit of extra work out there. But it's there. It's just that the issue is this lack of visibility, or this tendency to generalize cultures, or generalize things that we don't know of. And that's why I think it's important to have these types of conversations, and to learn more from others that way.
You have also started this conversation by making a podcast, which is called Project Voice, where you do not just have Vietnamese voices, but in general, people who identify as somewhat Asian, I'd say, and also female, non-binary. You give them a platform to tell their stories. Can you maybe tell us a bit about the history? So, where did this idea come from, and when did you start this?
So, like any millennial, or many of them, I wanted to start my own YouTube channel and create a storytelling platform, right? Because YouTube was a source of media representation for me, where I was able to get in touch with folks who looked like me, who could I could relate to with their experiences. And then I told myself, okay, let's start a video project called Project Voice. And it turned out not to be what I expected. The camera ended up being more of a barrier.
Okay, we've lost Jessica here. I hope she's coming back.
So I started Project Voice back in November 2016, just with the genuine interest of exploring certain topics that spoke to me as a second gen Asian American. And, I took one Asian American Studies course. Looking back, I wish I had taken more. But in a way, this podcast was like my own formation of my Asian American Studies course. So I was learning as I was going, interviewing folks I knew firstly, just peers I knew back in my college days, who also share similar experiences. So we cover topics that I always say that were accessible, not as heavy, more on the end where like you can talk about with anybody, like parents' expectations, societal expectations, my model minority myth, the just growing up as queer and Asian, beauty standards, and so on and so forth. So I would say it's surface level concepts, or it's more like intro Asian American Studies 101. And then as the seasons go on to introducing other folks that I didn't know myself personally, change makers, community leaders, folks who work in nonprofits. It was humbling to hear that there was much more depth to this topic than I had expected. Realizing that my podcast can't be the end all be all of our narratives, and it is just one of the many out there. And fortunately, over the years, as the podcasting landscape has grown, we see more and more podcasts of my fellow Asian Americans sharing. So it is encouraging to see that we are becoming, yeah, more in abundance with these stories that we have to tell. But that's where I started from. It was just from the personal, and it became political over time.
Yeah, the same kind of happened with us, which is Rise and Shine, that we started super personal. At least we were like two people, so we already had like two different family stories. Mm, but I was amazed, even with a strict, or not the strict, but at some point we decided to focus on the Vietnamese diaspora only. We also wanted to make it bigger and include all people who would identify as Asian. But when then we realized how little we even know about Vietnamese people, that even this country is already so rich and diverse in cultures and everything, that it's also getting more and more in depth. Um, but I was also wondering, where do your guests come from? So how do
Oh
you
yeah,
pick them, or do they introduce themselves? Yeah, how does it work?
we come from all walks of the world. I do want to make a disclaimer that I am not the first, especially
Mm,
coming into this space after a few years and realizing that there are many of those who have come before me who have done great work. There is a beautiful Asian American activist history that is in place, and um, the work is ongoing, and that the folks that I met, they're working, steadily, silently, and loudly, proudly within the nonprofit space. There's a few nonprofit organizations that have reached out to me and shared their research on intergenerational trauma, on the disaggregated data for the affirmative action policies, immigration/deportation/detention policy. So as you can tell, like deeper issues like that we got to explore in our podcast because of the experts that we're able to invite, as well as filmmakers, artists, musicians, authors, um, healers, coaches, uh, just people of different lived experiences. And they just heard about Project Voice online, and like, hey, I have a story that I think is worth telling, and I really do try to get as many folks in, and also starting out as a podcast originally for Asian American women, and then rebranding ourselves to women and non-binary folks. Something I have to
mm,
be conscious of is who I get to invite into this space, and knowing that we can't just spotlight East Asian narratives, but also Southeast Asian American and South Asian American, and also rebranding into not just Asian American, but of the Asian diaspora. When I had folks from Canada on board and Australia as well, and realizing that there are these, again, common threads, right? And just the rebranding keeps reaching farther and farther
mm.
out of the origin point. But I think that's the beauty of a passion project, is learning as I'm going and pursuing my curiosities, and knowing that, again, there's much more to what I originally thought it would be.
Would you say that the podcast and connecting so much with people from different communities has changed you as a person also? Because I would definitely say that for me and our podcast. For example, I would say that I became more Asian through the podcast. The more I connected with the community, the more we shared stories um, and visions also, the more I don't know, I felt like more connected. And then these were suddenly my people who have not even existed before in my life.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel more connected with my roots, more confident with telling others where I come from or my
Mm,
background, and just more myself. It also humbles me being in this space for so long, um, to know that, again, a lot of people are doing a lot of great work. And I'm just one of those folks who have something to share, and I was able to find a medium that works for me to share it with. and had the honor of inviting so many people, like friends and strangers, to be on board to share their stories. So yeah, I feel like I've changed over the years where, I am I'm just humbled. And also, like we talked about how the world can be a little too American centric and too US centric, and living abroad, traveling abroad, and meeting other people from other countries. I lived in Korea for uh, a little more than a year, and then Australia for a year, and I did some traveling um, before and after. It made me realize that it's kind of silly that we focus so much of our attention on the US, Um,
I didn't want to say this, but yeah.
yeah, I think it's sad that some countries see us or treat us like we're this global role model when we're not at all should be, especially given our current news. About 2 weeks ago, as you've heard, there was this domestic terrorist event that happened at the Capitol, and we had no guard, national security on board to protect our Congress people, and we had these Trump supporters just barging in the Capitol and endangering our representatives' lives, our people's lives. With I just when I heard about the news, I was completely shocked and sad to know that we are still in this place as the U.S. and that we have a lot of work to do before I can say that we're we're good. We're there. I don't know if we'll see it in my lifetime. I see that there's a lot of change and progress that's happening, and I understand that change takes time. With the up and coming new Biden administration, I look forward to new policies being put in place, new systemic changes in order to support the folks and communities that are most heavily hit by the COVID crisis. As you already know, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And it still runs true now. And so a lot of is happening in the US right now. And I feel like, yes, like I'm sometimes like, I understand why people are paying attention to us, because, you just can't believe at what you hear, what you see, but that's life sometimes. That's the reality of things.
You said before that you were not the first to do such a thing, like creating a platform. And you also don't want to be the last, right? Because you started the Project Voice Fund, which supports other people to tell their stories and to open up their own podcast. Can you tell us a bit more about this and how this also evolved, how you from a storyteller became someone who wants to enable others to tell stories?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, starting on podcasting and storytelling, I think that there comes to a point when I've had my fill. Like my cup is full because I've gotten my share of knowledge I wanted, and I'm ready to share it with the world. And I feel kind of old one time when I got invited to this panel where there are these younger podcasters telling me that they just launched or like have been in this space for a year. And I'm like, wow, I've been here for 4 years. And it's also weird at how they feel like they they struggle finding similar narratives to me. In my head, I'm betting myself that I bet that once they've been in the space for a few more years, they'll understand where I'm coming from. That, again, there are folks who have been doing this. Not wanting to invalidate their projects either, though. I think that it's beautiful that, it's still important to have their work out as, coming from their own voices still. And, I don't know, Gen Z, what's hot and what's happening in the generation sometimes. Yeah. So it's always nice to here, like if from their perspective as well, I also think younger generation is so fascinating to hear what they have to say. It's encouraging to see that they're open to these dialogues. They're more progressive and politically involved and tech savvy, and it's just a different generation, and I
Yeah.
definitely would love to uplift that. So be on this panel. I just shared what I had to share, but really, when it all comes down to it, like everyone has their own journeys, and we're all at very different points in our lives, and they will have their way of learning their own identities, and I'm just here to act as a guide or as a resource. Um, I am excited to pivot to this new and upcoming philanthropic project that is more on the back end, because as a podcaster, I'm so used to generating content, um, and being a public facing figure in one way or another. I don't really see myself as an influencer, nor do I aspire to be an influencer. Um, it's just that like I grown to
Mm,
appreciate the quiet unpublished work,
mm,
and I know there's a lot, again, amazing work that people don't see on
mm,
social media online that's still being done, right? And you see these folks on that, and like at my day job working in philanthropy, and I could go a bit more deeply with how problematic the industry can be, but I do have hope that it can also be a solution to our society in some way. Like, yes, it's part of the problem, but it can also be part of the solution. So I started this giving circle called the Project Voice Fund, and it's aimed at supporting um, POC, people of color led organizations, nonprofits that
mm.
are in the US. We just launched our general interest meeting last week. Been kind of impressed to see how
Congrats.
people are interested. Thanks. And I look forward to seeing which organizations we choose to support.
I think that's very beautiful. And even though I also see the problems, it's still a way of redirecting resources and putting it where you want to see it. And this is something I have definitely underestimated because I'm also like still or maybe forever creating content. And I wish to just do so. But now I realize it's not that easy to keep this going for years and years and years without proper funding. Um, so there need to be people who do think about these kind of things and who organize it and who try to get the money. and um,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Passion projects are great and fulfilling in their own way, but it can also be
mm,
unsustainable at times, and it can lead to burnouts. I know
mm,
myself, like I have experienced a few burnouts myself working
mm,
on my podcast. Um, and I think there are definitely suggestions on how you can avoid burnouts, and how you can better the situation in other ways. But I'm also a huge advocate on taking breaks and hiatuses when needed, because content is everywhere, and sometimes I feel overwhelmed with how much we have that
mm,
it's nice to just take a step back and focus on the moment, and go outside, even during COVID, like take a walk in nature
mm.
and appreciate what's happening. But yeah, I like in terms of my tips with burnouts, um, like teams help. I think it's great that you have a team as a
Mm.
podcast. Just making sure that the workload that you have is reasonable. I find myself giving myself more unnecessary work than I should, like busy work.
It's a somehow Asian problem. I don't know why we are doing this to
Yeah,
ourselves. Oh, of course, I do have an analysis, but still, even
yeah,
though we know we should not, and even though we know it's like we're in this racist system where we always have to prove ourselves, why can't we just realize and bam, get out of this dynamics? It's so
yeah,
hard, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
So.
one
I
of my
really
favorite.
appreciate you talking about taking a pause and stepping back and also taking care of yourself. I think it's very important that also we, as quite public people, do this and that we do talk about insecurities or phases of weakness or something like that. Because, in fact, I don't think that people expect as much from us as we do expect from ourselves. Um, for example, I don't even know whether people count how many episodes we're doing, but we push ourselves to do all the episodes regularly, for example. Um,
Yeah. One of my favorite sayings is your existence is resistance,
yeah,
and I embrace it. Like just living your life, experiencing joy. This is something I'm being more proactive on, especially during this time in quarantine. That my life has a is a finite time period, and I need to learn how to experience joy for myself and know that my joy is also my resistance. Um, and I think it's a beautiful saying. I just wanted to leave it at that. If we could even end the episode with
yeah.
one word of advice, that's it. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. And as cheesy as it sounds, it's like you're enough. So that's my
Yeah.
my words of the day.
Yeah, definitely. I would completely support this. Even though there's an ocean between us, I think it should be everywhere in the world. Like the same. You're enough. You're beautiful. Whatever you do, just do or don't. It's okay. It's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
So thank you, Jessica, very much. I really enjoyed our exchange. I always think it's also a powerful thing to just see how other people from across the world are living and sharing their views and perspectives. Also, not just on work, but also on life. I think that's very important. Um, I hope everyone who has tuned in had fun or enjoyed listening to us. Support Duc, who's putting together this amazing festival. I think it's a great initiative to bring together Vietnamese people from all over the world and from all different genres. And I'm also grateful that he put us two together because even though we've been following each other for years, I think,
Yes.
it's Duc who made us speak with each other.
Mhm. I am so grateful for our interview. I loved talking to you. Last time we chatted was more than an hour, and
Yeah.
you're just such an amazing person. And kudos to you for all the
Mm.
work that you're doing as a journalist. I think you're doing such fascinating work, like just interviewing and learning other people's stories. And so I'm very glad to have met you. And I have to also give a big shout out to Doug for bringing us together and organizing this amazing digital festival. I hope that everyone who is watching this gets to attend not only this interview, but also the many other cool interviews and events happening for this festival. So thank you for holding the space with me today, Vanessa.
You're very, very welcome. Bye, guys.
Bye.